Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have Ken Plum from Northern Virginia with us this morning. Welcome, sir.
Woody, it's always a pleasure to be with you, and thanks to Virginia Cable Television Network for doing these shows.
Well, thank you for your time. I wanted to ask you a kind of open-ended question first. What were your expectations for this session, and where are they now?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. You know, going into this session, we knew it would be different because we were coming off of a House of Delegate race in November of 2016, and it was dramatic. The changes that came about, 16 new members came into our ranks, and we'd never seen that kind of turnover in many years. But it wasn't just the numbers, it was the people. We now, for example, on the Democratic caucus side, we now have half women.
Half women.
That's an astonishing step forward. Normally, it would be like 20% at most, and sometimes around 10% or so. But then there's also a diversity in terms of African Americans, Latinos, a whole host of different folks now who, when you look at our caucus, it looks like Virginia. And quite frankly, that's very exciting. Those of us old white guys who've been around for a long time, of course, we had our ideas on how things should be done, but the world around us changes. There's even a millennial caucus in the House of Delegates now, and that's good news because it says that Virginia is growing and thriving and changing, and the legislature has to do some of that too. We just can't keep our foot always in the past. We've got to look at what the changes are in the future, and some of that came about as you witnessed this year as the election as the session moved forward. It was not always as cordial as I was hoping it might be. We went from 66 to 34 representation Republicans over Democrats to a 51-49. That would have suggested to me that maybe things might work a little more smoothly, but the fact of the matter is that there's still an effort on the part of the majority to hang on to what they got, and there's an effort on the part of the minority to get a piece of that. So that always causes a little tension, if you may. But again, growing out of that tension hopefully will be an appreciation of what we're about and recognizing that with Virginia, every 2 years there's an election in the House of Delegates, and now coming up on 2019, there also will be an election in the State Senate. State Senate's now held by Republicans 21-19. So it's a changing time in Virginia because it's a changing time in Virginia, so our legislature has to reflect that.
What about proportional representation on committees and subcommittees? Has that changed much as a result of the elections?
Yeah, it's changed in the fact that we now lose our votes by 1 or 2 rather than 4 or 5. And I say that jokingly, but the fact of the matter is that proportional representation, when you're at 51-49, with the rounding going up to the majority party, you're always behind a couple of votes. But ultimately, these votes shouldn't be about party. These votes ought to be about what's good for the Commonwealth. And so many times it gets, the partisanship gets us caught up in, I think, false choices. We need to be saying what's good for Virginia. And that needs to be dealt with, not on a partisan basis, but on a bipartisan basis to say, here's what we need to do going forward. I know we'll eventually talk about the budget here today, and I'll just use this as an illustration. The matter of Medicaid expansion, I never thought that should be a Democrat or Republican issue. I thought it should be a people's issue because there are 400,000 Virginians without adequate insurance to cover their health care needs. We shouldn't say, well, Republicans are against that, although the Republicans have been against it, and Democrats are for it. we should say, is that good for Virginians, and how can we respond to that need at a time that would be beneficial to everybody in the state?
And as I understand it, the Democrats through Governor Northam made a major concession in terms of expanding Medicaid by agreeing to the imposition of a work requirement or community service requirement. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, and Woody, I don't consider that really a great major concession. If you're able to work, you ought to work. If you're able to do community service, that's really healthy for people, both for the community and for the individuals. A lot was made of it, but I think if you take a look at what was laid out in terms of the provisions, you'll find that people who are not able because they have physical or emotional or whatever problems that stand in their way, they will still be able to get Medicaid. So for those who thought that was an important thing, we've done that, and that took away that barrier, and so then we move on to what is the next barrier. But it did help to start the discussions going forward.
Now, that's still a major impediment in terms of the budget, at least over in the Senate side, because the House of Delegates did adopt in its budget expansion of Medicaid. How do you think this is going to turn out?
No question that it is a complex thing to try to figure out. But what I like about where we are now is that we have people of goodwill, all of whom now recognize that we're going to expand Medicaid. That is night and day difference from what we had just a year ago. A year ago, no question about it, we would not expand Medicaid. Now we've got individuals on both sides of the aisle, individuals on both houses, sitting down trying to work through the complexities of how it is that we're going to expand Medicaid. And make no mistake about it, it's complicated, and a number of different approaches can be taken that have different consequences for us. But the thing being is, we've now agreed that we're going to do it. And once we've agreed we're going to do it, I think we can work through the details. Now, the thing that is not often apparent to people to realize is that the House included Medicaid expansion in its budget proposal, in the budget that passed the House, and at the same time appropriated about $300 million more to schools, colleges, and universities. The way it works with the federal money coming into the state, when you take on Medicaid expansion, when you in fact offer Medicaid expansion, you pick up a lot of state money that had been used to fund programs for people who couldn't meet their own health care needs. That's because of that infusion of federal money. And that infusion of federal money, incidentally, we've left on the table about $10 billion where we didn't take it. And now we're showing that if you take it, you can spend more money on your K-12 programs, you can spend more money on your colleges and universities, you can spend more money on health care services. So it's greatly to our advantage to make this expansion come about. I fully recognize that there's a number of different ways, and technically, that it can be done. That has to be thought through and worked through. We've got good people in the conference committees doing that from the House and the Senate, and I'm confident that we're going to make that come about. Now, whether we're going to make it come about by March 10th remains to be seen, but we have until July 1, not that we want to take that much time, and not that we would stay in town. You know, what happens is when you have the budget as a big item for this legislative session, it has to be completed by July 1. We expect to have it completed within our regular meeting time of 60 days, but if we don't make it, those of us who are not on the budget committee will go home in a recess, carry on our lives until we get the email or the call. We got it worked out, and then we'll run back down here one day and adopt it. But so, good step forward. Good step forward. We're actually working on doing it.
Has there been a time during your tenure where those budget conferees were unable to work out a budget?
Yeah.
What happens then?
Well, Virginia requires a balanced budget, and Virginia requires a budget. So there's no way you can get around it. By July 1, you got to have a budget. And so there's an accommodation, a recognition that we need to do that. We're also not big about government. You know, we only meet for that 60 days this year, and that'll be it unless there's some special need for us to meet further. So there's a commitment, I think, on everybody's part to get the job done. There's nothing like filibustering, for example, that you see at the federal level. So that you have to go to work to, again, make the budget balanced, because that's another requirement. We've got to have a budget and it's got to be balanced. So it's work that we've got to do, work that our voters expect us to do, work that we as responsible legislators know have to be done. So it's going to happen. Over the years, there have been various times of where the actual work on completing the budget has gone beyond the regular session of the legislature. I don't consider that a great issue. Again, since everybody's on the path towards getting it done. If there was half the conference committee sitting there with their arms folded saying we're not going to do it, then we'd be in serious trouble. What we've got now are people scratching their heads, digging through the numbers, and working to make an accommodation that will be satisfactory to all the people. That's what the legislative process is ultimately about. You know, it takes a complex issue with many facets and work through them and get everybody reasonably satisfied, and then we can come back if we need to in a special session. Although now we are, I guess we're what, 4 days from the end of the session, and amazing things can happen in the legislature in 4 days.
Talk to us a little bit more about this Medicaid expansion in terms of the population that we hope to serve.
Yeah, and Woody, I appreciate your question, because again, there's sometimes people have a notion that that's this government health insurance that you just get for free. And the answer is that Medicaid, the primary persons on Medicaid are children. That's the first category, right? The next category are people who are very old, aged, or infirm. They, you know, by virtue of their age, they need health care, but don't have an investment in health insurance of their own, and that kind of fills in the spot, the difference. Depending also upon your income as to whether or not you will actually be able to directly get Medicaid, or whether you will be able to get some help with your own insurance in the marketplace. So all those factors together make up Medicaid. But can you, as a healthy, working somebody, go in and make application and suddenly somebody provides your health care? Nope, doesn't work that way. You got to show a need, you got to meet the categories of income, and in those categories of income, I don't know how anybody with those levels of income, $10,000 to $12,000 a year, make it as it is.
Now, what about dual eligibles? You mentioned the elderly, those who qualify for Medicare, but still don't have the economic wherewithal to take care of themselves if they, for example, fall under dementia or Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you say, it is possible that you have people in categories where they would qualify for Medicaid because of their income, but they also might be of age to get Medicare. You don't get to double dip. You essentially get to figure out with your officer who signs you up for the programs as to which way you're going to get your eligibility. But most of us are blessed with not needing to get involved in the complexities of this. Either through our employers or through our own investments, we've been able to get health insurance and maintain that. But there are a number of folks, too many folks, who don't have an income level where they can seriously think about buying insurance because they're too busy thinking about buying food for the table. They're too busy thinking about paying their rent. How's my car start tomorrow morning so I can get to work? Those people then need some assist. Do we make it a handout, a giveaway? No, we make it something you can qualify for. And if you can qualify, hopefully that will get you in a position where over time you can, if possible, if you're able, then get back as a productive citizen. That's where the discussion about the work requirement comes into play, and I think correctly so.
Now, this work requirement, significant or not, will require approval of the federal government ultimately, will it not?
Yeah, the whole thing, once the courts decided that the states had to make application for Medicaid, a number of states have taken different approaches. And this is one of the more conservative approaches that's been taken in some other states. But that approach that you take first must get federal authorization. And that federal authorization comes from us making application to the federal government, and they decided going forward. The little unknown in this is that we've got a new administration, and we haven't had many new programs approved under this administration. So we've got to meet the requirements of the federal government. I think I would say they're generally reasonable as far as I can tell. But they have to be met because if the federal government's given the fiduciary responsibility of taking the monies that have been collected for Medicaid and applying them to the states, then they rightfully would want to know that they're being appropriately spent.
Now, how will this expansion, if at all, help with the opioid crisis that we're suffering from?
Well, it provides an avenue of health, and for some people, it might be a mental health situation of where someone might need mental health treatment as part of it. But also, too, if again it can get people into a category of where they physically are able to work and whatever, and are able to do that, that has an impact on the opioid crisis. Now, what we have to always be vigilant of is how it is that the opioids become so abundant in the healthcare place. And that's a whole nother issue outside of Medicaid expansion, to figure out how it is that these pills get into our community and spread around.
Now, you talked earlier about the House budget increasing, for example, aid to our schools, both local schools and our institutions of higher learning.
Yeah.
Are you satisfied with how those numbers have come out?
Yeah, I think realistically those numbers are about as big as you can get them, about as much as we can squeeze out of the system, if you will. In 2008, with the recession that occurred then, we had to make reductions on a lot of programs, and education really got walloped at that time. We've been steadily trying to dig our way back to where we were.
So we're still catching up.
We're still catching up, absolutely. And this brings us a big step forward in terms of that catch-up, something that we decided over the last several years to not spend any more money on, because no one wants to raise taxes, of course. And I understand that. But at the same time, we want to make an investment in our children, because these are the children that we want to come back and work in our communities and contribute to our communities. And we sell ourselves short when we don't make those long-term investments like those in education. So I'm not going to second guess what the House Appropriations Committee did, because again, freeing up the money that they needed to free up from the Medicaid and applying that to these priorities, very significant to me. The other priority I have to mention in that regard, beyond education, K-12 and college and university, is that money we're spending on mental health. The importance of having mental health crisis centers, where when somebody is in an episode of mental health need, that they need immediate attention and care, for fear that they will do violence maybe to themselves or to others. This is a fact that they're terribly ill. Being able to add more of those crisis centers in the states is very important. We're very fortunate in Northern Virginia. Our local governments, our whole community, with the abundance of resources that we have locally made investments here. But I want all the people of the Commonwealth to have the same kind of access to mental health care that we have that we're fortunate to have in our community. And it's only fair to the families and so on who suffer from these episodes that help be available to them.
As a former educator, I know you've been an advocate for pre-K education.
Yeah.
Talk to us about the importance of that.
Yeah, well, the numbers are clear. When you take a look at what are the numbers about what results from an educational program, how much do students gain and all that sort of thing, well, what we're coming to recognize is that the real potential for gain is on the front end of one's life. The brain development in the first couple of years. We used to say, 4-year-olds, and now we're saying 1- and 2-year-olds, because truthfully that's where it is that you can make an investment that will make a significant difference in the learning and the future success of an individual. We are, in Virginia, we're kind of lagging behind on that. We're coming along. There's now a recognition. We used to argue about whether we should put monies into programs for children that young. And I think that argument's pretty much gone away. I'm delighted when I come to Richmond to see how much money the Richmond Chamber of Commerce, for example, puts into publicizing the importance of preschool and early intervention. People who are educated and know about these things get it. They know that that's really where we need to start off, so that when the kids reach 3rd grade, they're already reading, they're already moving ahead. Remediation becomes a thing of the past because you got them off to a good start on the front end. Head Start was the early part of that concept. It's just that Head Start started when you were essentially 5 years old. Now, when we roll that back a little further, we can find that with less intervention, but early intervention, we can even have more success.
what's the prognosis for a child who cannot read at the third grade level when they reach that age?
Yeah, you know, it's tough sometimes. It's whether or not there's a physical, physiological, neurological problem, whatever that causes that to happen, or whether it's a situation in the home. The interventions in these cases are really complicated. What we have to keep in mind is that we have to educate the child. And when we take that approach, what it means is that rather than have a one-size-fits-all and all children go through this pipeline to get wherever they're going, we take a look at what the circumstances are for the child that we're working with. And for example, has the child been subjected to stress, abuse, or whatever? That's a great inhibitor of not being able to learn. Has the child suffered some physical damage? Have they been involved in an accident? Have they been abused? All those kind of factors reflect on how you learn. You got to take that into account when you plan the program. If you offer the same sauce for everybody, you're not going to get the same result at the end. So I like very much what we're doing these days now. And also in this legislative session, we've made strong steps forward to limiting the number of children that schools can suspend. Too many times in recent years it's been the case that we have viewed an incident in the school as being violent and so on, as being somehow part of a larger picture of violence, not recognizing that what might be inappropriate behavior for a young person might be something else for someone else. So that what we can do now is, rather than to say to a second grader, and I know this happens, you're suspended for a week, you're suspended for a month. The second grader has no idea what you're talking about. All they know is that they got in some kind of trouble and they get to stay home. Well, that's not the outcome that you want. What you have to recognize is that when that is done on a regular basis and that child spends too much time at home, where do they end up next? Too many times they end up in the criminal justice system. We have too many times in the past taken child behavior and treated it like it's criminal behavior, not recognizing that it's inappropriate behavior. The child has to be taught about that, and we don't let that go by without dealing with it. But we don't say to you, well, now you got to stay home from school, because we see now too many times that when you take those large suspension numbers and extend them out in terms of the life of that person, too many times they end up in the social justice system. They end up in jail, and we don't want that to happen. That classroom to jail pipeline, we refer to it, we're making steps in that.
So I understand now there's a 45-day limit that will be placed on the suspension of a student.
Yeah, and you know, I still think that's a big number, but it's a compromise number, because there were some children who were staying home virtually all year and not getting appropriate education. Now, when you step back from that and take a look at it, it puts additional pressure on the school systems, no question, because then they have to figure out what's the appropriate intervention that should occur if we're not going to suspend the child. But that appropriate intervention is about education. As I tell my son, who's a school teacher who works with some really troubled kids, the most troubled child is the one who needs you the most. That's the one where we really need to put our attention. Thank God most kids will go through school and do very well in spite of us, and they'll be fine. But the kids who need it, it makes more sense for us to do it early and turn that behavior around rather than spend what it costs to keep somebody in prison for a period of time.
How are we progressing in terms of dual enrollments at our high schools and junior colleges, and the use of apprenticeships?
Yeah, well, you know, again, when I was talking earlier about it's good to get new blood into the system because we look at things differently. We've been with this old K-12 system for 100 years, more than 100 years, and it's time to dust it off and take a look. Sometimes you hold children for 12 years in school, and if you talk to kids who were in their 12th grade, they'll tell you how bored they are. I mean, truthfully, it is the case that they're out and having to take a couple subjects, very boring, and they're waiting to go to college. The question becomes, well, why should you wait around to do that? Why can't you just collapse these two things together, where you collapse the ending of high school and the beginning of college together, and call it dual enrollment, so that you move on with your life. You're not going to run out of something to learn, and there's plenty to be learned. And this dual enrollment system is a way to get children off to an earlier start on things that they're interested in, things they may want to have an occupation about, but it's a good way to make good use of our resources and our kids getting on with learning.
In spite of having 49 Democratic members of the House of Delegates, there's been little or no movement in terms of gun legislation.
Yeah,
I think the Democratic leader last week gave an impassioned plea about 3 common sense proposals that had been introduced but never saw the light of day. Talk to us about why that's still occurring.
Oh, Woody, I wish I had a good answer for that, because your observation is absolutely correct. I'm surprised you didn't bring up my impassioned speech, because I made one too. But anyway, one of the things that he talked about in his impassioned speech was background checks. I introduced a background check bill, and I will tell you that public opinion polls says that 90% of the people in the world support background checks. If you say to someone, do you think somebody who's been violent in their past, violent criminal or whatever, should be able to carry a gun around? They'll say, no, no, no. Should anybody who, say, have mental health episodes where they might be a danger to themselves or others, should they have a gun? No, no, no. Well, then why don't we check this out with a background check? Unfortunately, my bill, like all the gun bills in the House, went to one subcommittee of 6 people, and all those bills died 4-2. Do you know that in the House of Delegates and the Senate this year, there were 70 gun safety bills introduced, and the number passed was 0?
0, 70, and the number passed 0.
0. And I'm sorry, I know about the Second Amendment, but as young people now who are getting involved in this issue say, how could you have a constitutional amendment that allows people to kill people? And that's what the Second Amendment's about. Second Amendment's about our militia and our keeping our communities safe. It's not about people having ability to buy huge volumes of ammunition, the huge numbers of magazines and devices that allow them to shoot so rapidly. And in fact, the assault weapons, the weapons of war that we allow people now to, and children to have these things. It doesn't make any sense. And when you look at the world and the developed countries, they don't have this problem of mass murders. They don't lose their freedoms because they don't allow everybody to carry a gun. And the notion that you should somehow protect children in school by having a teacher carry a gun, oh my gosh, we're better than that. We're better than that. Our community's better than that. But we need to say to outside advocacy groups like NRA, stop fueling this crazy talk about everybody needing a gun because somehow the government's going to come after you. This crazy talk about the government wants to take away all your guns and so on, it's not the case. What we want is a civilized society where people can feel safe in their church. We had a bill that was about to pass that would allow you to take your gun to church. Right now, you're not allowed to do that. Now, fortunately, that bill was pulled back. It didn't finally pass. But the answer is not more guns. The answer is common sense gun safety measures.
Great. Well, thank you for being with us, Delegate Ken Plum. Good to see you. Good luck. Hopefully, you'll get out of here by Saturday.
Thank you, Woody. Appreciate it.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.
Mm-hmm.